To this celebration of Anne Johnston and the research fellowship which she has funded and which is named after her. There is quite a lot that's going to be happening in the next hour, so all I will do is introduce the people who will speak. First of all, Gillian will say something. She will hand over to Martin Harris, who in a completely different life was very friendly with Anne. And then Gillian will say a few more words. Then Dan, the current Anne Johnston Fellow, will speak a little bit about his work. There is time for question and answers after that. And I hope you will all stay and have a glass of wine afterwards. So, Gillian.
It's a pleasure to have been invited to introduce this afternoon's event and to remember Anne Johnston, who endowed the research fellowship that our speaker Daniel Jolowitz currently holds. I was asked to say a little about her life. Now, I should explain that I never knew her, whereas Martin, who is going to speak afterwards, did, so we have a different take. She had a very unusual career, clearly. After graduating in economics with a first-class degree from University College London, she held a Fulbright scholarship at Michigan. And here she had a revelation. She discovered classical Greek and ancient numismatics, which from then on were her life passion. And she completely lost interest, we're told, in economics. However, after her marriage to Ted Buttery and their return to England when he was a visiting fellow at Clare Hall, she worked in the planning office of Cambridge City Council, where her economics came in very handy. Meanwhile, her career in numismatics had taken wing, and she was publishing widely in distinguished journals. This is a very Clare Hall story. The next thing that happened was that after she and Ted parted, she applied for and gained a research fellowship here and held it for 6 years. It's not every day, of course, that a local authority worker applies for one of these and gets it. It's, as so often happens, the moment when she started a second career. And thereafter she always felt a strong support for the college, and she left the bulk of her estate to us to found a research fellowship with a preference for the humanities. Invaluable gift. Whereas there are many funding streams, though never enough, for young, talented scientists, the supply for the humanities is narrow in the extreme, and her fellowship has given the necessary stepping stone to many people, and these bequests do transform people's lives. So I'm very glad to just give you that little sense of the person. Martin will speak now, and then I'll introduce Daniel Jolowitz.
Thank you, Gillian. As some of you probably know, I'm David's predecessor as president of the college. And so I came to know Anne latterly in that capacity. But I knew Anne in a quite different way, because for many, many years I've gone on a continental mountain walking group, of which Anne was a member for years and years before she became ill. And Anne was a fantastic member of a group which had so much in common: cultural, political, economic interests. A group that in its youth could walk mountains. Now we're just in its 28th year hill walkers. I mean, that's rather generous. But what I learned about Anne then was not only her fantastic commitment to the later part of her life, to her classical studies, but her passion for the world of nature. And as we walked through the Pyrenees and the Italian Alps, she would identify butterflies and flowers and all kinds of natural phenomena in ways that managed to capture the interest of 20 or more quite sophisticated people who were rather blasé about these things, but she could capture our enthusiasm completely. And then when she became ill and stopped coming on those walks, I rather lost touch with her until I came here to Clare Hall. And I knew by then she was seriously ill. And one of the other things I remember so much about Anne was that when she knew that she herself was not going to get better, she carried on undergoing the most extraordinarily invasive treatments, specifically to help those who came after her. And I admired that so very, very much. A tremendous contribution. And then finally, when I came here as president, I suddenly became aware that in our great intimate engagement concerts, there was a figure who came in just at the very last minute, sat at the back and disappeared the moment the concert ended, because by then she was very disfigured and she didn't want to appear in public, but she came to the concerts because classical music was another of her passions. She came right to the very end of her life to college. And she was so proud of what this college could do. She was so conscious of what it had enabled her to achieve, and she was so very anxious to encourage that in the future, and hence the fellowship which we're here to celebrate today. Anne was a very impressive woman indeed, and I think Clare Hall is proud that she was a member of our community.
Thank you. So we come now to the present holder of this fellowship, who is Dr. Daniel Jolowitz. He comes to us after a really starry Oxford career, having first at every level, distinctions at every level, and of course a PhD. And he's now also an invited lecturer at the Faculty of Classics here in Cambridge, writing courses on the Greek novel, Latin epic, and Catullus. It sounds quite a good array. And he's going to speak this afternoon about that lost tradition of popular ancient Greek novels and their debt to Rome. So, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much for those introductions. I feel slightly unworthy after all of that, so I'll try not to hold you all up before dinner. First, let me say how pleased I am to be given the opportunity to express my gratitude publicly to those who have made this fellowship possible. And as I come to the end of my 3 years here, I've begun to reflect more and more on this and to realise how lucky I am. So, yeah, I'd like to express my thanks to those who have made that possible. And in addition to this, I'd also like to take the opportunity to explain to you what it is I've actually been up to for the last 3 years, or at least some of what I've been up to for the last 3 years. The first thing to say is that I'm a classicist. That is, my interests lie in the literature, history and culture of the Greek and Latin world. More specifically, I'm interested in a corpus of texts that are known collectively as the ancient Greek novels. Now, 5 of these survive intact, that's not so many, and we also have a smattering of more fragmentary morsels that are preserved on papyri. It often comes as a surprise, as it did to me when I was an undergraduate, that these texts actually exist at all. Because when we think about the earliest novels, I suppose our minds turn to 17th and 18th century phenomena like maybe Daniel Defoe's Mull Flanders, or Samuel Johnston's Pamela or Clarissa, or things like this. And the idea that the novel as a literary form had its genesis in the 17th or 18th centuries is one of those things that's perpetuated by such influential scholars as Ian Watt, who wrote the Rise of the Novel. And it was also linked to innovations in technology like the printing press and the introduction of cheaper modes of paper manufacture. And because of this, the ancient exemplars of the novel often get left out of account. But before I go on to talk a little bit more about the ancient Greek exemplars, I think it's probably worth pausing for a moment to think just what it is we mean by a novel, because it's a notoriously slippery and amorphous thing to try and define, and to try and pinpoint its generic constituent features can actually be quite tough. So if we try and define it in a sentence, I would define it as follows: as extended prose fiction. Now, if we take it as extended prose fiction, then it's actually clear that phenomena fitting this description have existed much prior to the 17th and 18th centuries. In the medieval period, we had the chivalric romances with their knights and their kings and their quests and their love stories. In the 12th century, we had the Byzantine novels written under the Komnenian dynasty, And actually the ancient Greek novels were incredibly influential on these Byzantine novels. We also have the much better known Latin novels by people like Apuleius, who wrote the Metamorphoses, or the Golden Ass, as it's also known, and also Petronius's Satyricon. And these Latin novels often steal the limelight quite unfairly from the Greek novels that have been so influential on the literary tradition. So I'd like to introduce you to some of these ancient Greek novels. So we've got one by a man called Charitone, who wrote the Kyraeus and Callirrhoe. Some that people might have heard of is Longus's Daphnis and Chloe. Another one that's reasonably well known is by someone called Heliodorus, who wrote the Theagenes and Chariclea. And you'll notice with all of these titles that they're standardised in terms of the two protagonists, the male and female protagonists. The plot lines are also standardised insofar as what would happen is that these male and female protagonists, they meet, they fall in love, they're then married, but then, for example, the female protagonist is abducted by pirates and she gets scudded round the Mediterranean, encountering people who are trying to seduce her, until ultimately they end up reunited and living happily ever after. The other thing to say about these novels is that they're incredibly aware of themselves as being Greek. And what I mean by that is that they parade their status as Greek, both in terms of the sophistic language that they use, and I've alluded to their sophistic nature in the title of this talk, but also in the representation of the cultural practices. And I think this has a very, very clear message, namely that being Greek is the pinnacle of all existence. And despite the fact that they're written in the Common Era, that is in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome and the Roman Empire, under which they're writing, is strangely absent. Rome does not exist in these novels, or at least not on the surface, and I'll return to this. And the world that's offered to the readers is one in which is populated by a cast of Greek characters living in Greek cities, speaking Greek, and there's no hint of Rome whatsoever. And when I initially suggested this as a doctoral project, which, by the way, I've spent the fellowship converting into a book, but when I originally suggested this project, it was met with some resistance. And the reason being was this, is that my claim was that despite the Greekness of these texts, the authors knew Latin. They were aware of Latin literature, and they alluded in sophisticated ways to this Latin literature. To me, there are obvious signs of authors like Virgil and Ovid lurking between the lines here, or under the surface of these Greek texts. And this has quite serious ramifications, both for the way that we approach the texts and culture of this period, but also for the state of the discipline as it's studied and taught. Now, this might sound like quite a grand claim, but I make it for a good reason. Because, for a start, if it can be shown that the authors of these Greek novels are alluding to Latin and actively reading and engaging with Latin, then it undermines the scholarly orthodoxy that has it that Greeks influence Rome, but Romans do not influence Greeks. It sort of picks a hole in this orthodoxy. It means that Greeks recognised Latin literature as an institution, and this is something that is usually discarded as being beyond the pale. And it means despite the apparent Greekness of these texts, we're dealing with a bicultural phenomenon, not a monocultural one. And as I say, this has ramifications, I think, for the modern academy. Because classics as a discipline can get slightly ghettoised insofar as there are people who study Greek and there are people who study Latin. So, for example, when jobs are advertised, they'll be either for a Greek post or a Latin post. And this can lead to the creation within departments of arbitrary and potentially unhelpful boundaries. And this is especially the case in the last few decades when there's been an increasing specialism in PhD subjects. So you can see why a Hellenist might want to resist the suggestion that in order for them to understand the text that they knew so well, they actually now have to get to grips with a whole raft of Latin literature, in addition to the Greek specialisms that they'd spent their time thinking about. And I'd like to share an anecdote that I think typifies this. I was at the University of Crete a few years ago at a conference as a doctoral student, and a senior member of the department there in Crete approached me and asked me what my doctoral project was about, and I explained to him that I thought, well, I think these ancient Greek novels, that they're engaging with Latin. He was horrified. To be fair, he's a Greek man, but he was nevertheless horrified that there might be the vestiges of barbarous Latin lurking in these Greek texts. And he asked me in earnest, and I quote, "Why the hell would Greeks be interested in Latin?" And I then remember he gave me an avuncular pat on the back and wished me luck with my project, and that was that. But this actually had a profound effect on me, because not only did it make me realise how scholarly opinions can ossify to the point where people are resistant to ideas and suggestions, but I think he'd also unwittingly asked the important question: why precisely would the Greeks be interested in Latin? I thought this was an incredibly important question that he'd asked, quite unwittingly, in fact. Now, all of this is especially important for texts like the Greek novels, which up until 30 years ago had been met with complete scholarly scorn. They were derided as derivative, formulaic, of barely even of achieving the status of literature. At best, they were perceived as the light reading for the literary elite on their days off. And to be fair on these scholars prior to 30 years ago, there's very little by way of ancient literary criticism on these texts. If it weren't for the texts themselves, we wouldn't know they exist. The 2 or 3 references we have to these novels are unanimously disparaging. So, for example, a chap called Philostratus in the 3rd century writes a fictional letter to one of these novelists called Charitone, in which he refers to Charitone as a nobody. And then the Emperor Julian in the 4th century refers to silly love stories which he advises the recipient of the letter that he's writing not to bother with. It's a complete waste of time. They did, though, have one redeeming feature, at least according to the ancient medical profession. A 5th century doctor called Theodorus Priscianus had to deal with a male patient who was presenting symptoms of erectile dysfunction. And when this patient asked him, "Doctor, how am I going to be cured of this affliction?" The doctor said, "Go away and read some of these Greek novels." So it did have some redeeming feature. But there's also ancient evidence that belies the lowly status of these texts. And I'm talking here about the portions of the text that are preserved on papyri that have been dug up from the sands in Egypt. These papyri are actually very, very posh. An analogy might be coffee table books. They certainly are not suggestive of low-level light reading. They're actually suggestive of serious, sophisticated pieces of literature that have had money spent on them in their production. And as people have begun to realise this, as I say, in the last 30 years there's been a surge of scholarship on these novels, and they've actually now been rehabilitated and carry with them some sort of prestige. And they certainly benefited from the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s, and people are now very sensitive to the richness of these texts in terms of what they can tell us about culture and gender and indeed the sophisticated literary strategies that they put into practice. So my project seeks to build on some of this scholarly scaffolding, but it does it with a slight change of direction. And by introducing Latin into the equation, I want to suggest that this seriously affects how we approach the identity politics of the period. Because very simply, under the Roman Empire, if these novels, which parade themselves as Greek, do contain Latin, then one thing becomes very clear, and that's namely that under the Greek Empire, you cannot be entirely Greek. Rome and Roman literary cultural production will always find a way to worm its way in. And I want to return to the question of precisely why the Greeks would have bothered reading Latin in the first place and incorporating some of this material into their texts. And I think actually they did it in order to be a bit naughty and a bit subversive, and I'd like to conclude by talking about one example that I think typifies this. And the episode that I want to talk about comes from an author called Longus, who wrote the Daphnis and Chloe. And the Daphnis and Chloe, very briefly, is about two shepherd children who live on the Greek island of Lesbos, and they're brought up in the countryside as shepherds. And they fall in love, and ultimately at the end of the novel they get married and have children. But in the middle of the novel, we are introduced to an episode in which a party of urbanites turn up in order to hunt and inflict quite a bit of damage on the countryside. And what happens is that they turn up with these hunting dogs that are completely out of control, and the hunting dogs scare the goats of Daphnis and Chloe. And the goats scurry down to the coastline and nibble on a rope, and the rope is that which is being used by these hunters to moor their ship to the land. And what happens is the wind carries the ship off, and the hunters get very, very angry, beat Daphnis and Chloe up, and after a sequence of events, nearly a full-scale war breaks out. Now this is ultimately averted, and the hunters are sent packing, never to be heard of again. Now, this episode recalls in minute lexical detail an episode from Virgil's Aeneid. Now, Virgil's Aeneid is Rome's national poem and basically celebrates Roman identity and the foundation of Rome and the subsequent empire. And what happens in the middle of this poem is that the Trojans, whose descendants wind up being Romans, they turn up in the Italian countryside, go hunting. Their dog scares one of the stags, which then gets shot. A fight then breaks out, and the Romans beat up the Italians and the Italian local countrymen, and a war breaks out, the conclusion of which is the creation of the Roman Empire. So what's happened here, I think, is that Longus has rewritten Virgil's Aeneid in such a way as to make it that the Roman Empire never happened. He uses Virgil's Aeneid to essentially delete Rome from history. Now, there's a famous image from post-colonial studies whereby the slave uses the tools of the master to smash down the master's house. And I think actually that's what we've got going on here. We have the Greek provincial Longus using this monumental piece of Roman literature that celebrates Rome precisely in order to delete Rome from the scene of the crime. And I think, to conclude, that it's this generic elasticity and latitude that the literary form of the novel is charged with and that it brings with it, that means that it's available for such cultural work, and which means that it's managed to energise itself as a genre for the last 2,000 years, and is still the dominant literary form today. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for that. Questions, observations, disagreements?
Is it possible to determine the length of any of these novels ever ran to in their original form?
Yes. Most of the novels are divided into books, which would... so, for example, 2 of the novels have 8 books, and a book would constitute, in modern terms, a chapter. So an entire novel would be, for example, the equivalent of a 150-page modern novel, something like that.
Thank you.
The Greek historian Plutarch wrote about great Roman historical figures as well as great Greek historical figures. So he was a Greek who didn't ignore Rome and the Roman world.
That's quite right. And the one of the curious things about Plutarch is that the only... And Plutarch, it should be said, I think, is one of the most voluminous authors that we have from the Greek world. You could spend a whole month and you wouldn't get through his material even if you were reading in English. But the only way that we know that Plutarch was a Roman citizen is from a chance discovery of an inscription. So, despite all his writing, he never once admits that he's a Roman citizen. So there's something going on there. And I think also if you compare the Greek and Roman lives, there are ethical... he charges the Roman lives differently in terms of how he characterises Greeks versus Romans. So I think there is an identity politics being exercised here.
In the 2 centuries you alluded to, would it not have been the case that any educated Greek, any Greek educated enough to write the novels you described us, would have been bicultural, whether they like to admit it or not? Isn't that an inevitability?
That's quite right, which makes the scholarly orthodoxy that Greeks of this period weren't engaging with Latin so perverse. Yeah. It's perverse. I mean, the problem with the novels is that we don't know. They're ascribed to people like Carrington and Longus, but we don't know who they are. We don't know when they're writing really, and we don't know where they're writing. But what we do know is that they would have had access to libraries with Latin texts. There's evidence for this, and you're quite right that it in this sort of cosmopolitan environment that the Roman Empire was, of course they'd be palling it with Romans who would be talking about the latest whatever epic.
Can you say something about your lexical research on establishing this? For instance, whether just parallels of meaning or whether parallels of genre in the vocabulary?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the parallels exist both in outline and at the level of syntax and at the level of diction. So from the very sort of grassroots lexical detail up to sort of outline and how the episode develops. I mean, for example, this episode that I talked about in Longus, a later commentator called Macrobius says that this is an episode that was invented by Virgil. So we know that Longus has to be getting it. We know that Longus has to be getting it from Virgil. It's not the case that there could be a lost Greek common source that they're both drawing from. But to answer your question, it's really a range of evidence that is very grassroots up to sort of structural stuff as well.
That was a great talk, Dan, thank you. I have 2 questions, but they're quite small, and I think come together. And one is, do you think this rich kind of literary elusiveness, is that an integral part of the genre of the Greek novel? Or are these authors who are playing with the form? Is it kind of subversive? Is it witty? Is it that you go to this novel expecting something generic, romantic, and kind of silly and a bit empty, but you get something, if you know how to read it right, political? So that's the first question. The second one is, these early dismissive accounts of these novels, or doctors who prescribe them, like Viagra, is this are they kind of Philistines? Do they not get it? Are they, what's the mistake going on there?
Yeah. So in terms of the first question, how would an ancient reader approach the novel? Well, there would be a number of reading strategies for these things, and the problem that we have is that we don't have a sort of Platonic ideal against which we can measure what's going on. I mean, it's clear that there were a set repertoire of conventions that all novels had, but all the novels that we've got, it's clear that they're doing something weird with them. I mean, for example, one of the protagonists, the female protagonists in what would otherwise be considered sort of ideal novel, she actually commits bigamy. And in another novel, there's sort of premarital sex and all this type of thing. So it's very difficult to know what the baseline is against which to judge what we do have. To answer your second question, it's a head scratcher. The lack of ancient literary criticism on this stuff is totally bizarre, and there must be an explanation for it, but no one's really come to a determination on it. I mean, one of the things it could be, for example, is that it's just so generically expansive that people don't know what to do with it. And indeed, they are so formulaic and repetitive that I mean, just like modern tastes might find that rebarbative, so too might ancient tastes. They might sort of miss the joke. And I think that's often what's going on. But if you read these things properly, they're incredibly sophisticated.
What's happening after the 2nd century?
The novels sort of disappear, and then we get Heliodorus in the 4th century. Then they disappear completely until the 12th century Byzantine novels.
Why?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure actually. I purposefully don't look that far ahead, so I don't have to answer that question.
I'm sorry for asking it. So, thanks very much again, Dan. I have to say, I can't resist it, but I came across Anne when I was asked to write just a brief piece for her for the anniversary, about her for the anniversary book. So I looked at her file in the college archives, and there was this wonderful mystified correspondence of what is going on with somebody from the local planning office who failed her master's degree in economics, was applying for a research fellowship in classical numismatics with probably the 3 greatest classical numismatists in the world writing references for her. It was absolutely wonderful. It was puzzlement in Brian Pippard's hands. That was very good. But let me also echo something that Gillian said, which is about the importance that this research fellowship has for the humanities in Clare Hall, and I think for the humanities generally. That when we advertise non-stipendiary fellowships in the humanities, there's a trickle of applications. When we advertise stipendiary fellowships in the humanities, there is an absolute deluge of applications. So what we're trying to do is to build up the fund so that we'll be able to fill this fellowship out of our own resources on a 3-year rolling cycle. At the moment we need us to top it up, so we have to have a fallow year from time to time. But I think it's really important for the humanities, but also for the memory of Anne, and thanks to Anne for having been far-sighted enough to set this up. So we will carry on doing the work, and we hope that in 50 years' time somebody will be doing exactly the same thing as we're doing this evening, talking about her legacy to the college and what it means for us and what it has meant over the half-century. So thank you, Gillian, thank you, Martin, and thank you especially, Dan, for revealing this to us. Thank you all.